So I am here with Kevin, and Kevin is a Substack writer, and we are just throwing this together. Today's an especially chaotic day, but nonetheless, we persist. And probably the most interesting article that hit me when I checked out his Substack recently is called "Taking the Identity Out of Ideology." He's got I love the first image because I'm a big fan of graphs. I'm a big fan of charts. I'm a big fan of understanding political polarization. So we have a beautiful image from Pew Research, one of my favorite websites. They're showing Republicans have moved further to the right than Democrats have to the left. Now, that's a narrative that uh, I don't hear on the right wing. When I listen to those people and I ask them what's going on in America, they always say, well, we're the same right winger, we're the same conservatives that we've been since, I mean, we're actually liberals. Back in the 90s, I would have voted for Bill Clinton. But the left has moved so far. I mean, this is like an intellectual dark web talking point, like Brett Weinstein, a lot of those people, or I'm trying to think of Dave Rubin, for example. Even Bill Ackman or Elon Musk will say, well, in the 90s, I was a liberal, but the left has moved so far left that now I find myself as a moderate effectively on the right. Can you talk a little bit about why there's so much disagreement between the data that you're presenting and maybe your guess is why do Republicans feel that way if that's not reflected in the data?
Yeah, sure. So let me refresh my memory on what that graph was. I believe I just wanted to confirm something. Um, let's see. Okay, my computer is freaking out. So I guess I wasn't really necessarily trying to make a point about the Republican Party becoming more conservative, like relative to how liberal the Democratic Party has become, but more just that there actually has been this ideological sorting present in both parties. Um, but as for why the Republican Party, there's sort of disagreement about whether it's become more conservative is I would say that it's probably about like there are many different axes on which you can be conservative, right? So I think that, for example, I think like economically there has been a really like a really big shift in the Republican Party, like from like the from like if you go from like the Rockefeller Republicans era to like, the Tea Party Republican, just like the Republican Party became way more fiscally conservative. And I would say that that's less because of the opinions of people changing, but it's more that there was actually this sorting effect that took place. So I mean, it used to be that both parties are just like pretty wide tent coalitions that weren't particularly ideological. Whereas, especially as a result of, political primaries becoming voted on directly by voters as opposed to being selected from the party, people started to actually choose people that had like a specific ideology. So I think that if you look back at like, the 1960s, you might not be able to tell like what party a politician is from based on what they support. But nowadays, you can pretty much immediately tell, if they have this one position on economics, you can probably predict like all their other positions. Or if they have this one position on social issues, you can probably predict all their other issues. And that just like wasn't really a thing for a lot of American history. And I think it's definitely like, probably the most significant trend in American politics.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been researching is the history of the Democrat Party as it pertains to that flip on race. That the Democrat Party used to be very closely associated with the Confederacy, the KKK, segregation, and there was a flip. And tracing that flip, it's like the Southern Democrats pretty much stayed where they were. There wasn't a lot of change, but it was the Northern Democrats who were appealing to a lot of immigrant groups who were much more opposed to the idea or much more in favor of the idea of civil rights and equality for different ethnic groups. So that shift, as it was taking place, it already started, I mean, with Tammany Hall, really in the 1870s, you start to see the fact that the Southern Democrats are overwhelmingly Anglos, maybe Baptists, people who have been there, maybe their ancestors fought in the Civil War, and that but in the North, almost none of those people are staffing the Democrat Party or voting for it. It's almost all Irish Catholics, Jews, Italians, as well as sort of a working class coalition. But that's the ethnic distinction there. And those two wings of the party, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, seem to have been able to um, hold together coalition because they both agreed, like, we don't like Northern industrialists. The Southern Democrats said, we don't like Northern industrialists because they killed us in the Civil War. These new immigrant groups say, well, we don't like them because they're oppressive and capitalistic and waspy and so on. So that marriage was able to stay together over that kind of mutual resentment for an oppressive class. But eventually, the disagreements kind of broke out, and that's when you started to get these really explosive third-party movements like Strom Thurmond, George Wallace. I would say even Ross Perot is kind of an aftershock of that same underlying racial issue. But I think all of that is kind of speaking to this what we would describe as polarization, which is where you have two camps that are very ideologically defined rather than defined by like tax code or tariffs or the gold standard. That used to be a huge thing, like silver, gold, like that's totally out of people's minds now. But yeah, I wonder. So one of the things I would look at would be immigration itself as something that, in that case, you could make the argument that it ultimately resulted in more ideological polarization between the parties. Are there other underlying causes or factors that you would say have contributed to that shift? You've already mentioned the primary process as like an institutional structural change. But then the question is like, well, what even led to that change? Why did we move in that direction? Why don't we still? Maybe we're moving back to that direction now. Kamala Harris, she didn't win her primary according to popular. I mean, I didn't vote for Kamala Harris to be the candidate for 2024. I don't know who did, but are we moving back in that direction? Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I think they have their roots in like some of the progressive era reforms around democracy. Like I think direct election of I forget if it was senators or representatives or something was like a progressive era reform. But I think that most of this bigger stuff is pretty much just downstream of the fiasco that was the 1968 DNC. Like it was a situation that was just so bad and terrible that Democratic Party is just like, okay, gosh, I guess we just have to do direct primaries so that something like this never happens again. And so, in a lot of ways, I think the Democratic Party is still reeling from that. And I think in an interesting twist of fate, this 2024 cycle, which is like the first one in which well, maybe not the first one, but one of the first times in a while where the Democratic nominee has been selected in a, you could say, anti-democratic way like this, also held in Chicago. So I thought that was just like kind of a funny little coincidence. It's almost like there's something about the city that's somehow cursed.
Well, then we're also having these massive war protests, right? So you had the Chicago Vietnam War protests, and now, I mean, we'll see what happens, but supposedly there's going to be a huge Gaza protest. We'll see how that plays out. Can you speak a little bit to 1968? Was that the year? I'm trying to remember. Was that Nixon versus Humphrey?
Yeah, Nixon versus Humphrey, the year that RFK got assassinated.
So, you know, can you say much about like what led to that disaster? Like, obviously, Humphrey was sort of uniquely unpopular. Is that due to the fact that, there wasn't. Well, okay, so let me back up. There was obviously sort of an elephant in the room, which is George Wallace. And George Wallace saying, I'm totally breaking with FDR. I'm breaking with Truman. I'm breaking with Lyndon Johnson. I'm totally breaking with the direction the party's going in. And I'm a segregationist, and I'm going to run third party. What exactly he hoped to achieve with that in terms of actual political effect. I don't know that an argument can be made that he thought he was going to win in 1968, but I think maybe he thought, well, if I can force the Democrats to lose in 68, they'll realize that they need me, and then we can make some kind of compromise in 72, and through that wiggle room, like we can get some of what we want in the national platform. Um, that obviously didn't happen, and so part of the reason why 68 was such a disaster from a popularity standpoint, with Humphrey just not being electable, um, some of that may have just been simply a fact that the Democrats realized, okay, if George Wallace is going to do this, there's no way that we can win, so we'll just throw up some guy who's unpopular anyway. And then we need to figure out a strategy for 72 to take these people out of the picture. And so it was almost a mutually assured destruction thing. Like George Wallace knew he was going to lose. Humphrey, maybe, I'm supposing here, knew he was going to lose. They both knew they were going to lose. Sort of a game of chicken where it's like, who's willing to like keep doing this in 72? Like, we're doing this now, and in 4 years, are you still going to be here? And it kind of reminds me of what happened with Trump to an extent, where in the 2016 primaries they said, raise your hand if you will support the eventual nominee, and Trump didn't raise his hand. So it's that game of chicken where it's like, okay, I'm sort of almost like I'm almost like not even a Republican. I'm sort of like a third party candidate. And if you don't compromise me, if you don't work with me, I'm just going to blow up the party and Hillary's going to win. So that may have worked for Trump in 2016. Obviously didn't work for Wallace. So yeah, I would view that as one of the reasons why it was such a disaster. But they don't. I mean, obviously Nixon won in 72 as well. So that wasn't resolved. And then somehow, I guess the first time where Democrats were successful with that new primary system would have been 76 with Carter, right? So Carter gets in. That itself ended up being a disaster, but maybe that wasn't the fault of the primary process. Maybe there were other factors at play there.
I mean, Carter was really a primary success story, right? Because I mean, he was just this guy that wasn't really super high profile, but then he kind of just grassroots rode his way all the way to the presidency, and he ended up winning the general election. I guess I probably have a sunnier impression of Carter's presidency than you do. I think that I'm kind of a fan of Carter's presidency. I think that he gets a lot of undeserved flack.
Well, I would agree with you that Carter is hated on probably even worse than Nixon. I mean, in American political history, even though Watergate was this big scandal, at least at the time. I mean, the 1980 election was really devastating. But in terms of how he actually governed the country, in terms of what he did, was it a disaster in that respect? I don't know. I mean, obviously there was the Iran hostage crisis. There were these sort of marginal issues that, yeah, I mean, it's questionable whether Carter was to blame for the Iranian Revolution. Had, for instance, Nixon or Gerald Ford or some Republican been in charge, could they have really prevented that? And so can you really blame Carter for that? He took the blame. I mean, that was an effective kind of propaganda tool. It's almost similar to the way in which a lot of presidents are blamed for, economic recessions or something, when often the roots of those economic recessions go back 5, 10, 20 years or something like that. There's these deep institutional factors, or sometimes like in the case now we're looking at a major recession going on in Japan that affects the global economy. It's like, as an American president, what exactly are you supposed to do to prevent the economy of Japan from going into a recession and affecting your economy? So yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't have any personal animus against Carter, but it is interesting to see how Democrats were really struggling in that period from 68 until 92, until Bill Clinton came along. Like, first they were just trying to really get the segregationists out of the party and send a clear signal to Southern Democrats, like, we won't work with you if you're on board with that. We have to have a clear boundary here. And that was a process. And then Carter, in a sense, was like a cultural compromise. And I think the rise of evangelical Christianity played a large part in how he was able to appeal to Southern Democrats and saying, look, I'm an evangelical Christian. And he was really the first evangelical Christian president before George W. Bush. So he was able to appeal to that issue while at the same time, being liberal on a lot of social issues, being against segregation. But that jostling formula, trying to get the formula right, trying to get the voters on board and win national elections, yeah, it didn't really work until Clinton. And then you even look at Clinton, and if you combine the Perot vote together with Bush's vote, Clinton actually he didn't even get close to a majority of the popular vote. So in terms of like that ideological question of Kevin Phillips has this book on the Southern strategy, and he talks about forming a permanent Republican majority, and from that period from 68 to 92, it seemed to a lot of people that actually Republicans could create a permanent Republican majority until Bill Clinton was able to, basically with Ross Perot, kind of overthrow Bush. And that, there's so many issues here. I don't want to get too into the weeds and too far afield. But yeah, I mean, do you think that in the going forward are there indicators or trend lines that would lead us to believe that these one of these two parties is going to go through a similar kind of internal struggle that the Democrat Party was going through between 68 and 92, or do the parties right now seem more stable to you and like they've got things figured out?
The parties do not seem stable to me at all, particularly the Republican Party, given that at the moment it's mostly held together by being a cult of personality, with some shared belief in conspiracy theories thrown in. But I think that if you look at the lower level of, serious people trying to make policy at like the think tank level and decide where the Republican Party is going, there's a lot of internal dissent, like there are some people, like you can point to the J.D. Vances of the party, who want to make the Republican Party a lot more fiscally moderate. I believe that J.D. Vance has said that he's in favor of sectoral bargaining, which is kind of crazy for a Republican vice presidential nominee to say. Whereas there's also, of course, the old Koch brother faction of economic libertarians that are fighting against them, and in my opinion losing, because let's face it, there aren't that many libertarians in the electorate. And then you also have the evangelicals, and then also people who are more moderate on social issues. So I think there's a lot of back and forth, and it's really unclear who's going to come out on top. As for the Democratic Party, I think that the Democratic Party's real future liability is that it seems like the the bedrock of minority support is not quite as strong as it once was. I believe that Trump improved his totals amongst pretty much every minority group in 2020 compared to 2016. And also, I'm not sure how much this is being overreported, but it really seems like the Democratic Party is struggling to hold on to young men specifically. And I think that will be a serious liability for them going further if it continues. I think another kind of interesting concern for the Republican Party that I've seen talked about on Substack a few times is that because of the educational polarization in the parties, many Republicans being non-college educated, there's kind of this gap that has opened up in terms of ability to staff administrations with competent people, because it just really is hard to find people who are part of the political elite that have the credentials that you might want to be in the executive branch. And so I think that the Republican Party is really going to have to make overtures to the more credentialed swath of society if they would like to survive and actually see their policies effectively be implemented. Because if your entire federal bureaucracy is people who are liberal, I mean, there's like much harder limits to how effective you can be as a conservative administration.
Yeah, I mean, it's this paradox with JD Vance where he's simultaneously like, the most anti intellectual or anti-establishment, like working class guy, but then he's also like, a graduate from Yale or something, and he I don't know, worked for Peter Thiel or something like that. So there's that divide between this desire to present oneself, and I think again, going back to Carter, I think it was very clear in Carter that there was a desire to, and you can make the argument that Carter actually was the most honest populist of all the American presidents, that he like really was just a kind of a regular guy, and he had some convictions and some beliefs, and the people he brought on board were also kind of like these policy wonk people that were like, we really want to, I think it was called, it was like the Carter Brain Trust or something. They had a name for themselves. And, they were much less cynical and more optimistic. But I guess I've seen this progression from Carter. You could even, I mean, Nixon never presented himself as a populist. He presented sort of as an elitist, but he actually also was kind of from a normal background. He wasn't like brought up in the elite or anything.
And he had some pretty economically liberal policies too, right? Like, did he run on? Didn't he try to like? Didn't he support UBI at one point or something like that?
I've
I
never heard of that. That would be
yeah,
interesting.
I don't know. I
Um,
seem to remember something to that effect. UBI has a weird amount of support from like what people might think of as centrist politicians. Like, I believe Hillary Clinton almost ran on UBI, which is kind of crazy. So it definitely has fans from like across the ideological spectrum.
yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I always think of Nixon. I think he so there's like these layers that are with Nixon. He really does come from kind of this like middle class background, and then there's that story. There's a lot of private recordings of Nixon where he says these offensive things, and he's like, you know, he's making fun of Bohemian Grove. He's criticizing Bohemian Grove, and a lot of people read that as homophobia of what he's saying. But another way to read that is a kind of classism, that he feels like, hey, I'm just a normal guy. I like to go fishing. I like to, whatever. But now I'm surrounded by these elite people, and their tastes and their kind of dandyism is like too effete for me. So he had that like roughness about him that kind of rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Um, and of course, he did do Watergate, right? So he was willing to engage in some dirty tricks. Yeah, Carter, by contrast, he starts off kind of again from maybe a middle class background, through sheer populism and optimism and things, wins the presidency as a stark contrast to Richard Nixon, as kind of like this grumpy, cynical man. Um, but then you have, after Carter, you have Reagan, and Reagan has these like really, I wonder how much of it is unintentionally history is rhyming, or how much like Trump actually based his entire political career off Reagan, because Reagan started off in Hollywood. Actually, his first political speech was for Goldwater, but he didn't talk at all about the major issue, which was segregation. He just talked about tax policy and regulation and stuff. So he was always kind of riding this line, similar to maybe Trump was like, his first issue was like the birtherism. Like he was like, oh, I don't know if Obama's birth certificate is real. Not, it wasn't a substantial issue that affected anyone. It was a totally technical issue of like, I don't know if he can legally be president. Never saying like, oh, it's because he's black, or oh, I have a problem with immigration or something like that. That like technical sort of dog whistle, and then the fact that Reagan was popular in Hollywood, Trump was popular on TV. Obviously, Trump has a business background that distinguishes him from Reagan, but they both have that kind of crossover. I mean, Clinton, again, I mean, you have this series of presidents where it's like Clinton probably had the most sort of humble beginnings. I think he was the first president to be elected who grew up without his father. I think Gerald Ford actually was the first president of divorced parents, but he was the vice president of, or after, actually after Spiro Agnew. So I don't know where he came from, Secretary of State or wherever they pulled him from. But Clinton was the first one to be elected by people who didn't grow up with his father. His father had like 5 different wives, married to multiple women at the same time. So Clinton really came up from like almost like the similar upbringing to J.D. Vance in a certain sense. Became the president, and then George Bush Sr., I think, was sort of the last gasp of an elite American saying, like, I'm an elite American and I'm going to be the president. And then you had George Bush Jr., who, the son of him, but totally put on this evangelical, like, I got a Southern accent. I grew up in Connecticut, but now I have a Southern accent. And people would be like, I'd like to drink a beer with George Bush, and appealing to that. So since then, Obama obviously populist in a different way, appealing to young people on the internet, kind of like early Reddit, social media. Romney, totally going back to George Bush Sr. and then Trump. So there's that oscillation between the populism and the elitism. And I guess in this coming election, Trump's pick of J.D. Vance ostensibly outwardly is meant to project a form of populism, and also Kamala's choice of Tim Walz is also like, he's just this normal Midwesterner and he's like a moderate, dad and stuff like that. So I don't know, and maybe that is just because of the change in the primary system, that these choices have become so populist in nature. There are also studies that basically show that the political speeches have been decreasing their vocabulary complexity over time. So that's another trend that maybe it's even deeper than the primary process. Maybe it has to do with, some people would say it's the expanded electorate, but I mean, the electorate among white men, for example, hasn't the percentage of white men who are able to vote hasn't changed much actually in the last 50 to 100 years, and yet the reading level has continued to go down. So maybe that has to do with our education or some kind of deeper cultural issue. Would you have any guesses on that?
As to why like speeches have become less complex, or why candidates have become more populist, or
Well, a little
what?
bit of both. I mean, do you think those two things are connected? Do you think, there's that film Idiocracy, right? That's saying, okay, we're dumbing down as a society. We're going to have president. I don't even remember what the name of the president is in that film, but he's like a WWE wrestler or something. I think played by Terry Crews. And I mean, can this be? Is it more having to do with those institutional changes in the primary, that we're getting more populism and kind of more like folksy language and Sarah Palin and I'm just a regular American like you, but then you look into their CV and it's like, this is a total construct. This is a totally affected personality. Yeah, is that more the consequence of these structural changes in our politics, or would you attribute it to more underlying cultural factors?
Well, I do think the direct primary system has a lot to do with it. Kind of my mental model of how politics used to work is that you kind of just did have some partisan loyalty, but it was more actually focused on the party itself. Like if you were a Southern Democrat, it's just like everyone in your union was a Democrat, and you were kind of just like proud of being a Democrat in the same way that you were like proud of being a sports team. And it was more about like having someone rise to the top of the party who was, really well spoken and well credentialed. And because mass media wasn't as much of a thing, it was more important to kind of try to sway like, the establishment, especially before primaries. And so I think that before this ideological sorting, it was more about trying to show that your team has a guy that's like more competent at being president than the other guy. And I think part of the reason that people have kind of this nostalgia for Nixon is that even though he did have somewhat polarizing rhetoric, like he was definitely a guy that was trying to be like just super competent in like a somewhat non-ideological way. I think like obviously there were some ideological things that he did, but he also like created the EPA, for example. And so I think there is a sense in which he was trying to just like do the job of president as opposed to like do the job of Republican or do the job of Democrat. That is kind of appealing to people. But I think that as people got more sorted into ideological camps, it became more like kind of like the role of a like a Democratic president and a Republican president like became different. Like there were like less things that you kind of had to do in both cases, and it was more like a tug of war between like undoing the things that the last person did and then doing things that they wouldn't have done, etc. And so I think that polarization is really a lot deeper now.